Droughts, floods, fires, climate change, and COVID. It's easy to see why it seems like we're facing more challenges than opportunities as we head into 2022. So we can stick our head in the sand, laugh it off, or face it head on. It doesn't really matter what approach we take. When things get tough, the thing that gets us through is resilience. Resilience. It's a word that we've heard, read, and perhaps said many times in the last 2 years. But what does it actually mean to be truly resilient? We spoke to Paul Ryan about this. He is an expert on the topic and helps communities and organisations around the world grow their capacity to be resilient, and sometimes how to recognise and honour their vulnerabilities first.
Thanks again for taking the time to talk to me today. You're the director of something called the Australian Resilience Centre. What is a resilience centre and what does it do?
Yeah, good question. So it's a private organisation, so it's a private company, and really we formed it to provide some focus for the work that we do and the work that other people do. And the way we work generally is a part of our work is partnering with other people and organisations. So we deliberately really try to partner with lots of organisations. Part of it is research. So we do our own research and get research funds and that sort of stuff. And then part of it is just straight, consulting type work. So that mix varies depending at different times on different projects we've got on and different partnerships, etc. So we've been going about 15 years or so, and over that time, I've worked with a huge number of organisations in different ways. So from helping to think about the future and do planning to thinking about training and capacity building of people and staff, working with just communities who are in various stages of either thinking about preparing for the future or recovering from events like bushfires and flooding, that sort of stuff. And then, a bunch of research around different sorts of questions that, we all face and, the challenges that any society has thinking about climate change and infrastructure and, all sorts of different kind of questions about the future, I guess.
Okay, so you talk about questions about the future. What does that have to do with resilience, and what is resilience as such, as a word, as a concept?
Yeah. Well, one thing we know, resilience is a really overused word. That's the first thing we can say about resilience. Everyone uses that word, but actually when you get right down to it, it just means the capacity or the ability to cope with change. And that ability or that capacity is really important. It's always been important for human beings, right back from our evolution and right through the development of our society and civilizations and all of that sort of stuff. It's been important to be able to cope with unexpected things. And, as we all know, it's become even more important now that actually it's that capacity. It doesn't matter what you call it, and people get hung up on the word resilience, but it's the capacity, this idea of the ability to cope with change. And that could be about an individual. So it could be about mine or your capacity to cope with change, or it could be about our family or our business. It could be about our whole community or our town, we could be talking about, a state or the nation's ability to cope with change. And so it's what we'd call a multi-scale idea. It's something that goes from individuals through to, whole nations thinking about their ability to cope with change. And it's important because if we can't cope with change, there'll be impacts. There'll be impacts on us as individuals from events. And we all, at some point in our lives, will be impacted by some sort of unexpected event. So that could be something like a natural disaster, or it could just be, the loss of a job or, an illness or the loss of a loved one or a partner or whatever it might be. So at some point in our lives, we'll be challenged by and impacted by a sort of unanticipated or unexpected event. If we can cope with that, we can get our life functioning, back to functioning in the way we want it. That doesn't necessarily mean going back to exactly how it was. because that might not have been a great place to be, but it means getting it functioning after an impact or an event in a way we want it to function into the future. And that capacity to sort of get back to where we want to get to is critically important for individuals, because if we can't get to where we want to be after an impact, it'll start to impact on us mentally, physically. And if that persists, it starts to have a really serious impact on us. It impacts on our mental and physical health in ways that we really, means we suffer. We won't enjoy the sort of health and well-being that we want. But it also impacts on us in other ways. It impacts on us psychologically. And, to cope with that, we start to, either withdraw or get frustrated, or we might, drink more, or we might get angry, or all sorts of things. So there's all sorts of things happen at the individual level. It might also mean you don't go back to work, or you don't enjoy your work, or you're not as productive at work. So it starts to impact on you economically, etc. And if that continues, it's got really serious implications for people in terms of mental illness and physical health issues. So that's a problem. That's a problem for the individual, but it's a problem for the people around them. We can also talk about that same thing happening at a larger scale. So for a community or a whole group of people, if they can't, a whole group of people can't function the way they want to, can't get back to how they want to be following an impact or some sort of event, then that starts to impact on our whole society or our community and the way it functions. And so we see, that typically after big natural disasters, we've seen the impacts that last for, certainly for years and up to decades of having impact on communities and how they function and how they recover. And that's, again, at the individual level and groups of people. So it's important. Resilience really matters. And while we can sort of be frustrated about the overuse of the word, the core idea is a really important idea for human health and well-being, and it has implications for the way our society functions and the way our economy functions. So, of course, I would say that I'm involved in working on resilience, but actually when we look around, it's one of the biggest challenges we face now as a society is our ability to cope with these unexpected events. COVID, climate change, the economic instability, global instability, trade instability, all of those things that are really, we live in a turbulent world. Our ability to cope and our capacity to cope is becoming more and more important for everyday well-being of people and our community and society and economy.
That's so interesting. It makes me think of almost resilience being like a practice. Can anyone ever be truly resilient 100%?
No, you actually can't be, because everyone is vulnerable to some point and your capacity can be exceeded. There's human beings are fallible mentally and physically. Our systems, our economy, they're all, fallible in different ways, and they're all vulnerable to different types of impacts. And our capacity to cope can be exceeded. And that changes over your life. So from when you're young to, depending on the life stage you're at, you might have more capacity to cope with some things when you're younger, and that changes in the middle age and when you're older, and vice versa. You might have much more capacity to cope with things when you're older that you couldn't when you were younger. So your life stage, your life circumstances, your education, the support you have around you, the social connections, all of those things have a bearing on your ability to cope. And those things all change over the course of your life. But, and the other thing is when that capacity to cope is exceeded, we all, that's not a disaster for people, because it may just mean that you're impacted in a way that, you didn't want to be. Most people can recover and cope, but some people don't. And when that capacity is exceeded, and particularly if it persists for a long time, or if it's at particular vulnerable stages in people's lives, then that does have really serious implications. And the other thing I'd say is the combination of events matters. So, you might be able to cope with a natural disaster, but actually coping with COVID, and we've seen this in the region that I live in. We had, the Black Summer fires, and a number of people obviously severely impacted and traumatised by those events. but they coped reasonably well with recovering from the fires. But then COVID came along, and some of those people haven't coped well at all with the isolation that came, with COVID. And again, that varies for different people and different communities and your different life stage. But that combination of events, the timing, the sequencing of when they occur in your life, but also when they occur in relation to each other, those events can all have an impact. So, I always say everyone is vulnerable at some stage. Like, there is no one that is absolutely immune to the impacts of these unexpected events. And, I look at my father, he's an old farmer, tough as nails, still farming at 85 and can, work me into the ground on any day. And yet, he's really struggled through COVID with isolation, and he's struggled with navigating the complexity of getting, vaccinated and all those sorts of things. And so you can be as very resilient, individual physically, but you may not be, sort of in terms of the way you have to work through the system of life, you may not be very resilient when it comes to navigating bureaucracy, for example. So there's a bit of a misnomer that, sort of all rural people, all old farmers, people in, the harsher environments in Australia, that they're somehow, magically resilient. They're no more resilient or less resilient than any of us. It just depends on the type of disturbances and shocks that they're dealing with. And if you're exposed to a repeated event, like drought is a good example, after a while you learn how to cope. You learn the skills you need, you learn the strategies you need, and so you cope better over time if you're used to experiencing some sort of event. But a novel event like COVID actually comes along, and you could be a very resilient person to drought or to something else, and suddenly COVID comes along, and that has a significant impact on you. So there's no kind of generalising, these people are resilient and these people aren't. I think that's a misnomer, and I think it's sort of not a useful way to think about resilience in individuals and communities.
That's really good to know, and I think that sounds like a really good take-home message. And what can we do to learn how to deal with more unknown things? What do you do when you go out and talk to people and teach them how to be more resilient?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I do is actually talk about the past. We spend a lot of time looking backwards because most people don't realise the sort of nature of the events they've had to deal with. They kind of just are busy with life. But when you stop and put the focus back and say, okay, let's look backwards. What are the big events that have shaped this place, where you live? What's happened in this place? And they can be, social things, environmental things, economic things, natural disasters, whatever, policy decisions, all sorts of things. And we just map those out, and then we just kind of stand back and look at it. And one of the first reactions is, oh wow, a lot's happened here. A lot's happened to this place, And if you live in any kind of rural community over any length of time, of course you're going to have big events that are going to happen, natural disasters, but also diseases and shocks and all sorts of stuff. And so we spend time looking at that history and say, well, what allowed us to cope then? What were the things that helped us to cope as a community, and what are the things that actually made us vulnerable? And sometimes we'll focus in on a particular event. So we might pick, one big event that people are interested in and say, what happened? What was happening before that, just before that event? And then what happened after that event that allowed, or created the change in the system that allowed it to continue or whatever? And so sometimes we'll drill into some of those sort of events, and it's amazing the things you hear, the insights that come and the way that people see how those things have shaped their world. And then we'll start to talk about the future. So we'll pivot from the past to the future and say, well, let's look, looking back, we saw all these things that happened. Now let's look at the future and what could happen. And the first thing that people realise is there's no settled, there's no sort of notion of a settled fixed system. It's constantly being disturbed. And so that's a real insight and a useful starting point then to say, So how do we prepare for that future? What should we think about? And it's like, well, we can't predict it. That's the first thing. There's no point spending much time trying to predict what might happen in the future. And again, we'll reference back to the historical stuff and say, did anyone see this coming? Did anyone predict this? Did anyone? No, of course not. These are unexpected events. That's the nature of them. So there's a really important lesson. So we can't try to predict and plan in detail for these events because we don't know when the next drought will be. We don't know when the next flood will be. We don't know what policy decisions it's going to be. We don't know what economic crisis is going to come over the hill. So that's a real insight, for a start. So then it's like, well, what can we do then as a society? If we can't plan for those things in detail, what can we do? So it's like, okay, we can start to think about how we can prepare for some things that we don't know when they're going to hit. We don't know how bad they'll be, but we know they will come. We will have another drought. If you live on a floodplain, you will have another flood. If you live, somewhere that's fire prone, you will have another fire. So there's some things that we can say, okay, we don't know when they will happen, but we know we can prepare for them. And there's things that we can do to prepare. And then there's things that we can't prepare for, the unexpected things, pandemics and, things like that. And so then we talk about being generally resilient, so general resilience. And what are those things? And they're things like having strong connections in the community, having, skills and resources, having information and knowledge about what resources are available to help, et cetera, making sure that we are connected to decision makers and connected to services outside of our community so that when we need help, we can communicate. And so that's the physical communication stuff, but also the relationships and connections and those sorts of things. And so there's a whole kind of, way we can tease out the unexpected things where we need to be generally resilient and what we'd call specified resilience, things that we have to, that we know are likely to happen and we can prepare for some of those. And so those things we can do more, specific kind of preparation for. And so by dividing those, it into those kind of things, we can start to think about these are some really concrete actions that we can take. And these are things that are just like good things to do to build connection, to make sure we've got diversity, et cetera. And we know those things will help us regardless of whatever the event is, these things will help us. And so out of that falls, some actions, some things to do to start to think about and plan for the future.
That's awesome. And you've done this with people around the world, essentially, and communities around the world. Do you have a memory of a project that you've worked on or a community that you've worked with, either in Australia or somewhere else in the world, that really has had an outcome or that has fascinated or maybe even surprised yourself?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of, small moments like, we call them sort of aha moments in practice, but they really are when you see that light go on for a person or a community, when they start to look differently at the problems they're facing and the way they think about the future. So there's two that really stand out for me. One is very local, so working in central New South Wales with a community there at Yeovil, amazing bunch of people, just everyday people, farmers, people from the local church groups, people from some of the local, government services, just decided they had to come together and think about the future for their community because they saw so much or so many impacts of so many events over time: drought, fires, flood, suicide, a car accident, all sorts of things that had happened to this community. And so they got together and started to talk about how do we face the future, how do we build connection, and they did some really amazing things as a group, and they really started to think differently about their community and how they face the challenges. But there was a particular sort of conversation that happened after the event, after we'd done some work together, and one of the things they identified was just the need for connection. People are isolated on properties. and they just weren't connecting enough. There was lots of people suffering from mental health issues and stress and all sorts of stuff through the drought. They started doing this very simple thing, which they'd actually been doing a little bit before, but they made it a bit more organised and a bit more formal on a bigger scale. They had this process called beer and chips. Like, it's a really simple idea, but they picked a strategic location on the corner of, key roads in the district where people would be coming back from town and, taking kids to school and stuff. And, a set time once a month on that little corner, just literally on the roadside, in a little, gravel dump sort of thing, they would have beer and chips. They would stand around the back of utes, and you had to come in the clothes you're wearing. So no one was getting dressed up. No, it wasn't at anyone's house. All of that stuff. It was just a neutral space, totally informally. You come along, you stand around the back of the ute, and they open a few bags of chips and they have a couple of beers. But they started to pepper that conversation with things about mental health. They started to talk about connection. They started to talk about the services that are available in a really low-key way. And, the feedback we got was from one lady was just, she said, those beer and chip sessions saved my husband's life, And looking at it, if you look from outside, you would just say, it's not much. It was not a very big deal. But actually providing that connection, a sense that there is someone to talk to, someone had enough knowledge and information to go, you know what, mate, we need to keep an eye on this person, those sorts of things. And then the other little moment in that when that group was working together that really stood out for me was there was a lady whose husband had unfortunately passed away, and she was on a property on her own, and she was quite nervous about being on the property on her own, at night in a fairly isolated spot. So she had 3 locked gates, from between the road and the house. And someone, sort of brought this up in conversation, and they were very private about it. They were very discreet about it, but they said, I know someone and she's very nervous living on her own, and since her husband had died, and there's 3 locked gates. And if something happened, who would be able to get to her? Like, no one, who's got the key, And it turned out, maybe the next door neighbour had a key, but he was a truck driver who was away sometimes. And so, this started this conversation about who's vulnerable in our community and why. And it went from people who are like her, isolated for sort of, safety and physical and emotional, psychological reasons, to people who are isolated because their road access was really poor, people who were isolated and disconnected because their internet coverage was poor, people who had disabilities, people who were socially isolated. It was an incredibly powerful, sophisticated conversation from a group of people, farmers sitting around, and then it raised all the ethical issues. It's like, well, who are we to decide who's vulnerable in our community? Who should have this information? And so it led to a whole lot of kind of ethical conversations about, who has the right to sort of decide if someone's vulnerable and all that stuff. That was really interesting. But then they went around mapping this stuff, and they knew information that you could only know if you live in a place for a long time. They knew the people, they knew the landscape, they knew which bridges could carry a fire truck over a certain tonnage, they knew which roads got cut by floods early, all of that kind of stuff. And the overwhelming, sense that I had, and the word that came to mind, was just intimacy. Like, it was just intimacy with their community and with their landscape and with how their landscape worked. And, that was incredibly powerful to witness those 2 sort of little moments with that group. And, unfortunately COVID has got in the way, but they were at the stage of planning to buy 2 shipping containers and stock it with the stuff, 2 or 3 shipping containers, and stock it with the stuff that they thought their community needed to survive for 2 or 3 days. So generators, water purification stuff, basic shelters, medical supplies, nappies, all the stuff that people need in that first 2 to 3 days. It hasn't, progressed yet with COVID, and I'm hoping that they'll pick it up. The group sort of had to kind of lay low a bit. They're still working away in the background, but they haven't been able to get together as a community as much. But, incredibly powerful stuff, but simple, practical, local, and based on their knowledge that only they could have. No one else could do what they did.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's like a it makes me sort of think of, it's that type of stuff that even the local council wouldn't be able to deliver at that point in time with that type of pinpointed knowledge. So it really highlights that local knowledge.
It's this, it's this really kind of slippery concept of sort of localism at a really small scale, and it's it's all the knowledge that they lock away, and it's the observations that you make. That was the other thing. These people were observing their community, they were observing who needs help, and they were so diplomatic about it all too. There was no like, aren't we great? And there was none of that. This all happened behind the scenes. There was no one would even know that they were doing this work and thinking about it. They were so sort of careful about the way they did the work too, because they didn't want to offend anyone. They didn't want to, embarrass anyone or single anyone out, but they subtly went around and made connections with people and, help people to connect to each other and those sorts of things. So, yeah, amazing.
And tell me a little bit about yourself. How does one end up working in the space of resilience, and how does one end up with having a resilience centre as a business?
Yeah, I've always been, grew up on a farm, and my family's been farming for 160 years, and so just passionate about farming and rural communities and rural people, and love rural people and rural landscapes. I'm passionate about rural environments. So I started off actually working on birds on farms and looking at the trees that farmers were planting and seeing what value they were for birds, ironically. So I'm a bird watcher by training. And through that, working with lots of farmers, and you just have lots of conversations, and then the world kind of just started to broaden out from birds for me to, thinking about, well, how do people cope with all of these sorts of changes, and what ways can we support people to cope with, all the challenges, etc. And then I was lucky enough to work in CSIRO and work with a bunch of scientists who were working on resilience stuff. And so I had the great privilege of working with some of the people who essentially came up with these core resilience ideas for a number of years. And so I learned a lot from them, but they were predominantly, scientists, they were academics. And so they often were looking at it from a research perspective, whereas I wasn't a researcher. I'm a failed academic sort of. I was much more interested in how do you apply this on the ground. And so after a while, that just became the natural step, was to go on, out of sort of that sort of more academic and research world to starting to go back to, working with farmers and communities. And so that's been the little kind of loop I've done, and I'm back working in the landscapes that I love and with the people that I love. And, it gets more challenging in some ways because of the impacts we've had, fires, droughts, et cetera, but it also has become easier because the conversation is easier to have. Like, it's never been easier to talk about resilience, the resilience of people and mental health and all of those things, but also the resilience of our communities and of our economies and of our farming communities and all that stuff. It's the number one topic almost when you go and talk to people on the ground. And so from that perspective, it's actually life's getting easier, to work with people and to help communities to do the work they want to do. But of course, enormous challenges too, with the way the climate's changing and the speed it's changing, and the impacts we've seen from drought and bushfire and flooding and those sorts of things. Resilience is more relevant, more important than it's ever been.
And that was Paul Ryan, Director of the Australian Resilience Centre, joining me there. I'm Joran Lorenzen from the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation. Paul currently works with the foundation supporting the delivery of a number of programs. More information about his work is available on the Australian Resilience Centre's website at ausresilience.com.au. That's AUS for Oz, resilience.com.au. And you'll find more information on the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation's programs on our website at rural-leaders.org.au. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this podcast.